Assalamu alaikum. In today's session, we are going to discuss the educational systems and their relationship with the development of a developing economy. In this discussion, we are going to discuss majorly two things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the political economy of educational supply and demand. And the second thing we will talk about is the relationship between the social costs and benefits and the private costs and benefits. And I will explain to you how, on the basis of these four important concepts, the social cost and benefit and the private cost and benefit, the educational acquisition is attained. या कितने लोग education हासिल करते हैं developing country में, वो इन दो अहम factors के through explain की जा सकती है. One is the political economy of the supply and demand of educational attainment, and the second we are going to discuss is the comparison or the relationship between the social cost and benefit analysis with the political cost and benefit analysis. So the first thing I'm going to discuss in detail with you is the political economy of educational supply and demand. So under this head, it has been discussed and worked out that the educational acquisition or educational attainment in the developing countries is obtained as a result of the interaction between the demand and the supply of educational attainment. In other words, or in simple words in Urdu, we can see that जो इल्म हासिल करते हैं लोग या कोई भी एजुकेशनल क्वालिफिकेशन हासिल करते हैं डेवलपिंग इकोनॉमी में, वो एक पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी के कॉन्सेप्ट के तौर पे देखा जा सकता है, जहां हम देखेंगे कि लोग डिमांड करते हैं एजुकेशन को एंड देयर विल बी सप्लाई फ्रॉम द गवर्नमेंट साइड, एंड बिकॉज ऑफ द इंटरेक्शन ऑफ दीज टू थिंग्स देयर विल बी सम लेवल ऑफ एजुकेशन दैट विल बी ऑफर्ड एंड प्रोवाइडेड टू द पीपल लिविंग इन अ डेवलपिंग इकोनॉमी. So the first thing you must be thinking about is what is meant by political economy. So I'm going to define the political economy by in words which I have, like this definition has been taken from Investopedia, and according to them, political economy is the study and use of how economic theory and methods influence the ideology of the political group of people, those who are going to make any sort of policies, and if it is defined in terms of by considering the laws or the theories of economics, then we call that type of policy making procedure as the political economy. So it is the interplay between economics, law and politics, and how we also, under the head of political economy, we also see that how the institutions develop in different social and economic systems such as capitalism, socialism and communism. And we also see or analyze in political economy how public policy is created and implemented. So if we look at the demand of from the demand side, demand for the educational attainment, so we see that demand of education depends upon a number of factors, but the major factors include that the family sees that what are the different types of benefits which we are going to get if we send our child to the school, or if we send our child to get some educational qualification, what are going to be the benefits which we as a family on the whole, or and at the same time this particular individual whom we are going to send for acquisition of educational attainment is going to get. This is one thing. Second thing on which the demand for educational acquisition depends upon is that they see that what are going to be the costs of getting this education, and this particular thing is based upon two types of costs. Both the direct costs and the indirect costs are accounted for when they make up the decision. So broadly, demand for education depends upon two major things. One is the benefit which the family is going to get, and the second important aspect is the cost. There are other factors also which we are going to discuss later on, but these are the two major things. So if we look at the demand for educational attainment, we see that it is a derived demand. The major thing is the original demand is for the employment opportunities. Like people foresee that when our child will graduate or will get a certain level of education, these are the different types of employment prospects which he may get into. So that employment opportunities basically are the original demand. So the demand for the educational acquisition or the educational qualification is considered to be the derived demand. Derived demand means basically that if the demand for something appears to be there because of the demand of some other thing, that type of demand is called derived demand. And I'm going to illustrate the concept of derived demand using a simple example. For example, if in an economy or in a certain society the demand for cars increases, automatically the demand for the mechanics who are going to fix the car when it is broken, or the demand for petrol, or the demand for other spare parts which you will be needing when you are going to use the cars, and there may be some sort of problems that can be there with the cars. So the demand for the mechanics, for the workshops, for the spare parts, and for the fuel obviously is the derived demand, whereas in this example the original demand was for the cars. The next thing is the supply side. So when we look at the supply side of the educational acquisition or education kitni hasil karte hain, like what is the number of the schools and the colleges and the universities that are in place in a certain country. So we see that the quantity of schools or any other educational institutions, they are primarily determined mainly by the political process. So ये employment opportunities को consider करके नहीं बनाई जाती है. The idea behind how many schools are going to be set up in different areas and how many universities are going to be there, yes, altogether it's because of certain political decision making. So and this has majorly or explicitly nothing to do with the economic aspects or the economic criteria that may be used in order to assess in developing countries that this is the need in certain area, and this is that is why we need to open this many number of schools or colleges in this area. That particular aspect is not accounted for. Majorly the decision making of on the supply side, that what is going to be the number of schools, colleges and other educational institutions that should be set up in a certain place during a certain year, is altogether a political process. So another important thing which we need to look at is the government expenditure set for the educational purpose. So it is also something which is decided on political basis, and the expenditures are fixed. They do not change, vary over time, like they are not considered to be very flexible, and the way that the demographics are changing in a society, or the number of kids are rising, or the number of uneducated people are rising, this particular aspect is not flexible and is not altered accordingly. So we see that as long as the supply side of education opportunities is concerned, they are kind of like comparatively fixed, because the government expenditure on education is fixed, and at the same time the number of setting up of the schools and the colleges and universities and other educational institutions is also decided as per the political process, not because of the usage of certain economic criteria. So we see some sort of rigidity towards on the supply side. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, the demand of the school, the demand of the amount of schooling, how many years a child will go to the school, what is the overall qualification which the children are going to get, are majorly dependent upon the employment opportunities which the parents of or that individual is keeping in his or her mind. So it's majorly the wage or the income differential that plays a significant role in determining the demand for amount of schooling. The second important thing which is accounted for is the probability of success in finding some nice job. And the third important thing that is accounted for or that explains the demand for the amount of schooling is the direct private costs of education. People consider that if we send our children to the school or for some higher education, what is the overall direct cost that we need to pay. Another important thing that is accounted for or considered is the opportunity cost which they have to bear, and particularly when we are talking about the developing countries where the overall per capita income of poor class or the lower income category is pretty low. So there they see that the opportunity cost of sending their kids to school or for some sort of education, both the formal or informal, seems to be relatively higher, because if they do not send their kids to school, they may send their children to do some sort of work, and by doing that economic activity, by doing that work, they will be able to generate some sort of income for the family. So therefore, in these kinds of situations, the opportunity cost will be there, and that is also accounted for when they decide for the amount of schooling that is demanded by the parents or the individual. If he has to decide, or he is facing a trade-off between whether he should go for work, earn some living, or at the same time leave the work and go for some sort of education acquisition, etc. So these are the things that together help us in understanding the supply side and demand side. So unlike the market mechanism, in which we see that both the supply and demand, they intersect and corresponding to the point of intersection, we determine the quantity, the equilibrium quantity and the market clearing price. It is very it is not the case in this case. Education के acquisition के लिए हमें supply और demand की forces का interaction तो देखने को मिलता है, but we do not see any efficient allocation of resources. We see that the supply is relatively fixed, the demand is there, which is dependent upon a number of factors that have nothing to do with the factors that influence the supply. Supply seems to be a bit rigid, and overall the supply and the amount demanded are equated not by the price adjusting market mechanism as I've just discussed with you, but it is rather institutionally decided, or the state intervenes and they decide that this is going to be the price that will be paid by the people who are participating in this process of acquiring education, and it will not be the market price as determined by the market mechanism. So we see that particularly in the developing countries, the market price is relatively the market price of getting education is relatively lower as compared to what the prices charged for education in particularly in the case of higher education in the developed countries. Although we know that the basic education is free in developed nations and the higher education is relatively expensive. So we see in the developing countries in particular that the price which is set for education is not because of the interaction of a free market mechanism and the interaction of the demand and supply forces. It is majorly determined by the state, or the government intervenes and set the prices. So this helps us in understanding that overall the resource allocation in this particular area in developing countries in particular is not very efficient. So we also see that in most of the developing countries there are certain things that need to be looked at, and we see that if we look at the modern and traditional sector or the rural and the urban areas, we see that there is a wage differential which is sometimes as high as 100%. So in other words, हम अगर रूरल एरिया और अर्बन एरिया के वेज डिफरेंशियल्स को देखें कि कितनी वेजेस हैं ऑन एवरेज, व्हाट इज द एवरेज वेज रेट इन द रूरल एरिया and what is the average wage rate in the urban area, we see that there is a large discrepancy, or we see that the wage differentials are relatively higher. Similarly, traditional modern sector में भी आपको वेज डिफरेंशियल काफ़ी ज़्यादा देखने को मिलता है डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज़ में, और ये फ़र्क कुछ सिचुएशंस में 100% जितना हाई भी है. सो दैट that is creating some sort of movement, या हम देखते हैं कि इसकी वजह से भी हमें कुछ ट्रांजिशन देखने को मिलेगा जो कि अर्बनाइजेशन कॉज करता है, या डायरेक्ट ट्रांसफर ऑफ लेबर फोर्स फ्रॉम द रूरल सेक्टर एंड फ्रॉम द ट्रेडिशनल सेक्टर टुवर्ड्स द मॉडर्न सेक्टर और द अर्बन एरिया में आपको ट्रांजिशन देखने को मिलती है. अनदर इम्पॉर्टेंट थिंग विच वी ऑब्जर्व इज दैट जब हम प्राइमरी एजुकेशन क्वालिफाइड इंडिविजुअल्स की वेज को देखें और सेकेंडरी एजुकेशन क्वालिफाइड इंडिविजुअल्स की वेज को देखेंगे तो उसमें भी आपको काफ़ी फ़र्क देखने को मिलता है. सो फर्स्ट आई डिस्कस दैट विद इन across the sectors, rural and urban में आपको wage differential देखने को मिल रही है. Then the second thing which I have discussed with you or I have mentioned is that when you look at the qualification, the people who are having primary qualification या जिनकी जो primary pass लोग हैं, उनकी wage को अगर हम compare करें with the people who are secondary qualified, जिन्होंने metric किया हुआ है, उनकी wage में तो आपको फिर again थोड़ा काफी significant फर्क देखने को मिलता है. So this is another important thing which will help us in understanding something which I am going to introduce to you later. So another important thing which we see is that when we look at in terms of the developing countries, there the higher education, although it is very expensive, but it is highly subsidized. So people find it very easy that if they are performing good in terms of acquiring education and they want to pursue for the further qualification, वो अगर higher education level के ऊपर अपने तालीम को जारी रखना चाहते हैं तो वो उनको बहुत expensive नहीं पड़ती, because developing country की सूरत हाल को मद्देनजर रखने के बाद the governments decide and the donor agencies also say and suggest that because the human capital is so very low, so we need to make the overall acquisition of higher education या university level की education को काफ़ी cheap या सस्ता कर दिया जाता है. So if somebody wants to pursue for the higher qualification or higher education in developing countries, so that seems to be a bit cheaper relatively as compared to if you are planning to go for higher education in a developed nation. There you see that it is pretty expensive. So आप अपनी तालीम को कंटिन्यू करना आसान समझते हैं क्योंकि वो बहुत ज़्यादा महंगी नहीं है. So that helps in understanding a certain phenomena that takes place in the developing economies. As I just mentioned कि एक तो सबसे पहली उनको चीज़ लग रही है कि हम अगर रूरल एरिया में से मूव कर जाएंगे अर्बन एरिया की तरफ तो हमें वेज डिफरेंशियल काफ़ी ज़्यादा बड़ा देखने को मिलता है और वहाँ जो वेजेस हैं इन द अर्बन एरियाज एंड इन द मॉडर्न सेक्टर दे आर प्रिटी हाई, वो काफ़ी सिग्निफिकेंटली ज़्यादा हैं as compared to what they get in the rural area or in the traditional sector. Secondly, they also see that if they continue with their education, then it is relatively cheap. और जितना higher education हासिल करते चले जाएंगे developing countries के अंदर, उतना आपका जो income है या wage का average income है वो भी बढ़ता चला जाएगा और wage differentials become significantly different and they keep on varying when the level of education or the qualification is enhanced. जैसे जैसे qualification बढ़ती चली जाएगी वैसे वैसे आपका जो wage differential है उसमें फ़र्क पड़ता चला जाएगा. So these are the things जिसकी वजह से लोग काफ़ी ज़्यादा लोग वो हाई लेवल ऑफ एजुकेशन की तरफ चलते जाते हैं ताकि वो एक बड़ा डिफरेंस्ड लेवल ऑफ वेज को अर्न कर सके. एंड बिकॉज द हायर एजुकेशन इज सब्सिडाइज्ड इन डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज या ये ऑफर की जाती है बहुत चीप पैकेज के फॉर्म में एंड ऑल द बर्डन इज बोर्न बाय द गवर्नमेंट. सो वी सी दैट बिकॉज ऑफ दैट इनएफिशिएंसीज क्रीप इन और हम देखते हैं कि बहुत से ऐसे रिसोर्सेज जो कि according to this political economy relationship of demand and supply interaction, we see that a number of resources that could have been used more efficiently by if they are spent on some other areas where the development can be enhanced, वो आपके educational sector के ऊपर spend होके बहुत ज़्यादा efficiency को create नहीं कर रहे होते कि some people keep on continuing with their educational attainment ताकि उनके wage differentials बढ़ें और as we will see later that जितना आप high level of education पे जाते जाएंगे वहाँ आपका जो social return है वो कम होता जाता है जबकि private return जो है वो काफ़ी increase कर जाती है. So overall we see that the major beneficiary in this case is the individual who acquires high level of education because उसके high level of education का ज़्यादातर जो फ़ायदा है वो उसको पहुंचता है मगर major cost is borne by the government. or the educational department. So that's the reason we see that the political pressure is there, और जिसकी वजह से आप institutions को set up करते हैं या बड़े budget के heads को allocate करते हैं for higher education. But we see that overall जब हम फर्क देखेंगे कि ज़्यादातर फ़ायदा किसको पहुंच रहा है, तो we see that the overall major benefit goes to the individual instead of the society. So according to this particular theory, it is stated that it is both inequitable and economically inefficient in the developing countries, where we see that lots and lots of resources that are scarce are allocated for higher education, and since it is very expensive, but that expensiveness is not experienced or borne by the individual who goes out for higher education. The government bears the burden of that expensive education. So it results in a big difference in the wages, because if the qualification is higher as compared to the other people, naturally you get highly paid, and the return which you are going to get in this case on the personal terms will be many times higher from the return which you are going to give to the society on the whole. So therefore this particular process is considered to be pretty inequitable and economically inefficient. The next thing which I am going to discuss with you is the next model which I mentioned earlier, that it is sometimes important to see the social versus the private benefits and costs. So before I explain the model using a diagram which I am going to describe to you later on, it is important to first understand what is meant by the social benefit, the social cost, the private benefit and the private costs. So initially I am going to discuss what is meant by social cost of education. So social cost of education is basically the opportunity cost, which is borne by the society on the whole, and it results from the need to finance costly educational expansion at higher levels, when these limited funds might be more productively used in other sectors of the economy. And we see that as the students move up the educational ladder, जैसे जैसे educational qualification बढ़ती चली जाएगी, वैसे वैसे जो उसका social cost of education है, that keeps on increasing, because the society has to pay many times more as compared to what the student himself is contributing towards getting that education. So at the same time, this is the social cost. फिर हम discuss करने जा रहे हैं कि what is meant by private cost. So private cost of education is the money which you are going to pay, which a student himself pays in order to get education. So we see that as the educational qualification increases, the private cost increases relatively slowly. On the other hand, as I just mentioned, social cost, जैसे जैसे आप कोई भी इंडिविजुअल जो है वो एजुकेशनल लेडर पे ऊपर और मज़ीद चढ़ता चला जाता है, तो उसका जो सोशल कॉस्ट है वो बढ़ना शुरू हो जाता है, बिकॉज आप बहुत सारे ऐसे के रिसोर्सेज को कहीं और जहाँ पे ज़्यादा एफिशिएंटली खर्च कर सकते थे, आप वहाँ से उठा के एलोकेट कर रहे हैं टुवर्ड्स this higher education acquisition. So, and we know higher education is considered to be very, very expensive as compared to primary education. According to some study, higher education, एक आदमी को higher education देना 41 times ज़्यादा expensive है as compared to if you are providing primary education to an individual. So we see that जितना आप higher education provide करते हैं लोगों को developing economies के अंदर, चूँकि ये गवर्नमेंट ज़्यादा उसका बर्डन खुद बियर करती है, खुद बर्दाश्त करती है, जिसकी वजह से जैसे जैसे हम एजुकेशनल लेडर पे ऊपर चलते चले जाएंगे, गवर्नमेंट आपका बर्डन बियर कर रही है, देयरफॉर सोशल कॉस्ट इंक्रीज कर रही है और प्राइवेट कॉस्ट आपका फॉल करता जाता है. और अगर आप एक्सेप्शनली अच्छा परफॉर्म कर रहे हैं हायर एजुकेशन को हासिल करने के वास्ते, तो हो सकता है कि आपको कोई स्कॉलरशिप्स, कोई बर्सरीज, कोई इस तरह के बेनिफिट्स दिए जाएं जिसमें आपका जो प्राइवेट कॉस्ट है ऑफ गेटिंग हायर एजुकेशन वो बिल्कुल ही ख़त्म हो जाए या ना होने के बराबर हो जाए. So these are the two things that are related to the social cost and the private cost. The next thing which I am going to discuss with you is the social benefit and the private benefit. So social benefit is the benefit which is attained by the society on the whole. So अगर हम देख रहे हैं कि entire society के अंदर कोई भी लोगों के पढ़े लिखे होने की वजह से कोई सफाई बढ़ रही है या लोगों के जो अवेयरनेस इंक्रीज करा है या उनको हाइजीन को अच्छा रखने के लिए या क्लीनलीनेस को मेंटेन करने के वास्ते, if there is some sort of information that is being passed on and somebody is reading on your behalf and he or she is passing or sharing some information with you, being educated, वो आपको उसका कोई भी फायदा पहुंच रहा है as a society on the whole, so that is a social benefit. And the private benefit would be the overall stream of incomes that will be earned by that individual after attaining that educational qualification. So it is the overall both the monetary terms का benefit और non-monetary terms का benefit दोनों जो कि एक individual को हासिल होते हैं कि कोई भी individual economic unit को by acquiring a certain educational qualification. So that is the private benefit. So when we look at the comparison of the two, I want you to look at this diagram. इस डायग्राम में बहुत नाइसली एक्सप्लेन किया गया है प्राइवेट रिटर्न्स एंड कॉस्ट्स को और सोशल रिटर्न्स एंड कॉस्ट्स को. इन द फर्स्ट पैनल you are seeing that years of schooling completed are taken along the x-axis and the return and costs are taken along the vertical axis. So you can see that अगर हम सिर्फ private cost को consider करें तो private cost आपके primary education के ऊपर relatively low है, secondary education के ऊपर बढ़ जाती है and then it slightly increases further. उसका स्लोप थोड़ा सा और आपको देखने को मिलेगा पॉजिटिव है, राइज करता है, which is for the tertiary education or the higher education. But if you look at the returns, the private returns in particular or the expected private returns are drawn in panel A in this diagram. So you can see that when you acquire primary education, it rises and it further rises up when you acquire the secondary education, and it continuously keeps on rising when you are getting the tertiary education or the higher education. So you can see that when the tertiary education is attained or acquired, the gap between the expected private returns and the private costs becomes the maximum. वहाँ आपको दोनों कर्व्स के दरमियान में जो फ़र्क है वो काफ़ी बड़ा देखने को मिलेगा and that is the maximum difference that has been attained. आप अगर प्राइमरी लेवल के ऊपर फ़र्क देखेंगे दोनों ग्राफ्स का बीच का, which is represented by the height of an arrowhead जो कि प्राइमरी के ऊपर आपको देखने को मिल रही है. That arrowhead tells you the net return which you are getting when you acquire or attain the primary education. The arrowhead which has been drawn in the secondary panel, सेकेंडरी वाले सेक्शन में जो एरोहेड देखने को मिलेगी आपको, वो आपको डिफरेंस बता रही है, नेट रिटर्न बता रही है इफ़ यू अटेन सेकेंडरी एजुकेशन, कि आपका जो प्राइवेट रिटर्न्स हैं वो काफ़ी हाई हैं और जो आपकी प्राइवेट कॉस्ट है दैट इज़ रिलेटिवली लोअर एंड यू गेट सफिशिएंटली लार्ज private returns in this case or net returns, but the arrowhead length becomes the maximum when you look at the tertiary section. So अगर आप tertiary education को या higher education को acquire कर लेते हैं तो आपका जो private return है that becomes the highest और जो आपकी private cost है that is not very high. So the difference between the two is the largest, which indicates that अगर हम प्राइवेट रिटर्न को और प्राइवेट कॉस्ट को इन दो चीज़ों को अकाउंट फॉर करें तो इंडिविजुअल्स के लिए बेहतरीन कॉम्बिनेशन ये है कि वो हायर एजुकेशन को हासिल करें जहां नेट रिटर्न बिकम्स द मैक्सिमम फॉर देमसेल्व्स. In panel B, again you can see that the years of schooling completed has been taken up on the x-axis, and on the vertical axis the returns and costs have been accounted for. Again यहाँ आपको देखने को मिलेगा social returns को dotted line के साथ के curve के साथ represent किया गया है, and then there are social costs which are drawn by a curve जो कि पहले एक आपको राइजिंग कर्व देखने को मिलती है, बट इट बिकम्स शार्पली राइजिंग वंस वी रीच द सेक्शन वेयर द टर्शियरी एजुकेशन का कॉस्ट हैज़ बीन अकाउंटेड फॉर. सो अगैन आई एम गोइंग टू डिस्कस द 3 लेवल्स ऑफ एजुकेशन. प्राइमरी लेवल के ऊपर आप देखते हैं तो हमें नज़र आता है कि जो रिटर्न्स हैं वो काफ़ी हाई हैं और कॉस्ट इज़ रिलेटिवली लोएस्ट. चूँकि प्राइमरी एजुकेशन मैंने अभी मेंशन करा कि काफ़ी सस्ती होती है एज़ कम्पेयर टू द हायर और द टर्शरी एजुकेशन. सो यहाँ आपकी जो गैप है बिटवीन द रिटर्न एंड द कॉस्ट, or we can say that the net return which the society will be getting, it becomes the maximum in the case of primary education in a developing economy. And if you move further, अगर आप मज़ीद आगे चले जाते हैं सेकेंडरी एजुकेशन के ऊपर, you will be able to see that the gap between the two curves is reduced, and eventually when you look at the tertiary education's section, you will be seeing that the social cost curve rise so much that they intersect the social return curve and it rises further up. कि social cost आपके exceed कर गए हैं social return से, और in other words अगर आप इस point of intersection के beyond schooling हासिल करते हैं लोग, तो वहाँ आपका जो कॉस्ट है वो बढ़ जाता है एज कम्पेयर टू द रिटर्न्स विच द सोसाइटी इज गेटिंग. इट इंडिकेट्स दैट द नेट रिटर्न्स टू द सोसाइटी ऑफ गेटिंग हायर एजुकेशन becomes minus or becomes negative. So if we look at the efficient or inefficient combinations in the two cases, we see that if you are looking from the perspective of an individual, you see that the private returns and the private costs, when we account for these two things, the ideal situation or the most appropriate combination in that case, or we can say that the optimal combination would be that the individuals should go for a higher education जहाँ उनकी जो net return है वो maximum हो जाती है. But if we look at the same situation from the society's perspective, so we see that the gap or the net return is the highest in case of primary education, whereas when we look at the gap in terms of the tertiary education, we see that the net return even becomes negative, because we know that higher education is many times expensive, and since it is subsidized in the developing countries, therefore most of the burden of the cost of higher education is borne by the government or the society. So we see that in this case the social net return of getting education becomes even negative. So again we see that the optimal strategy would be to secure as much schooling as possible, but the optimal strategy for the society as a whole tells us that the net return becomes maximum in the case of primary education, although it does not mean that we should go for just offering primary education in a certain society, particularly in the context of a developing economy. Although we see that if we not only include the social cost or the social benefits, we do consider the private returns or the private net return also, we see that there will be some sort of improvements in the economy. And again, it is not recommended at all that we should stop funding the higher education, because in a society where a large number of people get a relatively low level of income, it will not be possible for these families who are earning less levels of income to afford higher education for their children. And because of this, the situation will be pretty dismal, or it will be it would not be a nice idea to stop the funding of the higher education, because somehow not in immediate context, we see that the higher education acquired by individuals living in an economy have long-term positive impacts on the overall improvement of the development process of an economy. The next thing which I am going to discuss with you is something which is very, very interesting, and that is the distribution of education. So perhaps you can recall that we discussed the distribution of income, and that is also known as the income inequality, or in other words, we can see that in our society there are some people who are having low levels of income, and there are some people who are having high levels of income, and that indicate or that show that the distribution of income is not equal, and therefore we are interested in knowing the extent of inequality of income distribution in an economy. And that is something which is an important indicator of development, where it is important to understand that what is the overall level of distribution of income in an economy. Likewise, now I am going to explain to you that we also see that it is not just the income which is unequally distributed in an economy, particularly if we are talking in terms of a developing country like Pakistan. We see that the educational qualifications are not also evenly distributed among the people, and we see that there are large discrepancies in the distribution of educational qualification among different classes in an economy. So you would see that if we take the example of Pakistan, we see that there are the people who are sitting in the low income category or the low income group people are it is hard for them to survive or to fulfill their basic needs. And if we compare the educational attainments of the people living in that very low income group with the educational attainments or the educational qualifications of the people who are sitting in the highest income group, you will see that it is very unfair and uneven distribution even on the basis of educational qualification. So the way we use Gini coefficient, Lorentz curves in order to determine the extent of inequalities in the income distribution, similarly we use Lorentz curves for the distribution of educational attainment or the educational qualification in an economy as well. So I'm just going to show you some distributions. So over here in this figure, you will be able to see two figures in which the Lorentz curves have been plotted. As long as the interpretation of the Lorentz curves and the construction of the Lorentz curves are concerned, they are exactly the same thing. So we know जिस तरह से income inequality में Lorentz curve जितना line of equality से ज़्यादा दूर है, उतना वो income inequality ज़्यादा show करता है. Similarly, अगर आप educational attainment की या educational qualification की लॉरेंस कर्व बनाते हैं या डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ एजुकेशनल क्वालिफिकेशन को अगर हम देखें तो इट इज़ लॉरेंस कर्व विल बी obtained by taking the cumulative proportion of population of 15 and over in percentage form along the x-axis. Along the vertical axis, the cumulative proportion of schooling in percentage form has been taken up. So there is this line of equality also. अगर किसी इकोनॉमी का लॉरेंस कर्व लाइन ऑफ इक्वालिटी के ऊपर ओवरलैप कर रहा है, दैट मीन्स दैट सभी जो डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ लोग हैं, सभी लोगों का एजुकेशनल अटेनमेंट ऑलमोस्ट सेम है. So if you see that the Lorentz curve which we have drawn for a certain country for a certain year is far away or far below from the line of equality, we see that वहाँ जो education की distribution है, that is not equal. There will be some people who lack education and there will be some people जिनके पास education है. So हमें वहाँ educational का unequal distribution देखने को मिलता है. The diagram which you are seeing right now provides the Lorentz curves for education in India and South Korea. The first diagram on the left hand side is the schooling in India, and the startling thing which you will be seeing in this diagram is that nearly more than 50% of the total population in India in this diagram is without any educational qualification. So it starts off from after 50% of the total population and then it starts rising. So if you compare this Lorentz curve with the curve which has been plotted in the diagram which is drawn next to this one is for South Korea, and there you can see that the population from where the education starts off is around closer to 10%. So we can see or interpret that almost 8 or 9% of the total population living in very low income category probably is the one which is without any education. But we see the Lorentz curve that is starting off from almost like the value of 9% onwards, and if you look at the gap between the line of equality and the Lorentz curve for South Africa, that is also relatively smaller as compared to the gap of the Lorentz curve between the Lorentz curve and the line of equality that is plotted for India. So we can, on the basis of these two curves, we can infer that the educational inequality is many times larger in India as compared to the educational inequality in South Korea. And also another important thing which we see in this diagram is that the mean years of education in India is calculated and estimated as 2.95 years, and the Gini, education Gini value has been calculated as 0.69 for India, whereas the mean schooling or the mean educational qualification years that have been estimated for South Korea are 10.04 years, and the Gini value, the educational Gini, has been estimated as 0.22, which is fairly smaller as compared to 0.69, which is the estimated value of education Gini for India. So again, the interpretation is the same as I mentioned earlier, कि जितना बड़ा वैल्यू होगा जीनी का, क्लोजर टू 1 उतना इनइक्वालिटी ज़्यादा शो करता है. 0 के पास आएगी तो दैट मीन्स देयर इज परफेक्ट इक्वालिटी. एंड अनदर बेंचमार्क, अनदर स्टैंडर्ड विच वी यूज इन ऑर्डर टू इंटरप्रेट द लॉरेंस कर्व इज दैट लॉरेंस कर्व का लाइन ऑफ इक्वालिटी से जितना ज़्यादा डिस्टेंस होगा उतना इनइक्वालिटी ज़्यादा रिप्रेजेंट करती है, एज कैन बी सीन in this diagram where you can analyze yourself that South Korea indicates कि यहाँ पे एक तो average year of schooling is relatively higher as compared to India, which like 10.04 and 2.95 years for India. And the second thing is that the education Gini is also low, which indicates that वहाँ inequality relatively low है in South Korea comparatively if you compare with India. The next thing which I am going to discuss with you is the Gini coefficient for education in 85 countries. This is this output या एक आपको figure लिया गया है from the World Bank's report that got published in the year 2000. 85 countries have been estimated, have been accounted for in the sample, जिनकी average years of education और educational Gini coefficient को उठा के इस diagram में plot किया गया है. So you can see that the idea was to see whether the educational inequality qualifies or satisfies the Simon-Kuznets inverted U hypothesis, which is there for income inequality or not. So we can see कि यहाँ हमें अगर हम average years of education को और Gini for education को draw करें तो हमें inverted U तो नहीं मिलती है, हमें एक downward sloping curve देखने को मिल रहा है. And you can see that जितना आपका Gini coefficient, education Gini coefficient की value high है, उतना ही जो average years of education है that is low. And जैसे ही average years of education बढ़नी शुरू हो जाती है, आपका जो overall education inequality की value है, which is measured and represented by the education Gini coefficient. In this diagram it is taken along the vertical axis. वो आपका value देखने को मिल रहा है कि वो low हो जाता है. So we can see that there is this negatively sloping curve which represents the relationship between average years of education and the education Gini coefficient. And we see that average years of education, if is low, then the educational Gini is relatively higher, and if the average years of schooling is very high, then you will see that the inequality in the distribution of income in the distribution of educational qualification also goes down. So there is this inverse relationship. So from this relationship हम एक चीज़ को conclude कर सकते हैं या infer कर सकते हैं that normally it is observed as per this study is concerned, या वैसे भी generally अगर हम कोई और data भी लेते हैं तो उसमें हमें यही नज़र आता है कि अगर हम average years of schooling को बढ़ा लें तो हमारा जो income education का inequality है in an economy that is sharply declined. So उससे हमें फ़ायदा ये पहुँचता है कि हम एक तो आपकी एजुकेशनल डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन की जो डिस्पैरिटीज़ हैं उसको आप कम करते हैं, प्लस एट द सेम टाइम आपका एवरेज ईयर्स ऑफ स्कूलिंग इज़ ऑल्सो इंक्रीजिंग. समटाइम्स इट इज़ बिलीव्ड दैट जैसे जैसे लोग एजुकेशन को ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा हासिल करते चले जाएंगे वैसे वैसे इनकम इनइक्वालिटी भी कम हो जाएगा, और दैट विल ऑल्सो हेल्प अस in reducing the absolute poverty levels in an economy. But if we look at the statistical analysis and the empirical investigations that have been conducted so far, generally we have observed a certain thing that is happening in most of the cases. और वो क्या है कि जब एजुकेशनल अटेनमेंट या एजुकेशनल एक्विजिशन जो है वो बढ़ता चला जाता है, वैसे वैसे हमें देखने को मिलता है कि जो आपका इनकम इनइक्वालिटी है या वो बहुत कम होने की बजाय हमें राइज होता हुआ देखने को मिलता है. So the explanation of behind this increase in the income inequality when the educational attainment increases in an economy is that when the people start getting education, particularly अगर लो इनकम कैटेगरी में लोग बैठे हुए हैं, उनको हाईली सब्सिडाइज्ड आपने हायर लेवल ऑफ एजुकेशन को रेंडर किया है या सर्विसेज ऑफर किए हैं, तो उनमें से जो भी लोग हायर एजुकेशन को एक्वायर करते हैं, उनका जो वेज है या उनके जो सैलरीज हैं, दे विल बी मेनी टाइम्स हायर फ्रॉम द वेजेस विच द पीपल विल बी गेटिंग दैट आर अनएजुकेटेड, अनस्किल्ड या प्राइमरी लेवल के ऊपर अगर एजुकेटेड हैं तो उनका इनकम हायर एजुकेशन अटेन्ड इंडिविजुअल्स या वर्कफोर्स से काफ़ी कम होता है. एंड इफ दे आर एबल टू if the educated class even if previously they were sitting in the low income category, वो एजुकेशन हासिल करके जो भी इनकम हासिल करेंगे या अर्न करेंगे वो काफ़ी ज़्यादा है फ्रॉम दोज हु आर स्टिल सिटिंग इन द लो इनकम कैटेगरी. तो उससे हमें ये देखने को मिलता है कि ओवरऑल इनकम इनइक्वालिटी एजुकेशन अटेनमेंट के बढ़ने की वजह से बजाय इसके कि वो कम हो, वो इंक्रीज करना शुरू कर देती है. एंड वी ऑल्सो सी दैट मेजरली इट इज़ बिकॉज ऑफ द पॉजिटिव कोरिलेशन बिटवीन द लेवल ऑफ एजुकेशन एंड द लेवल ऑफ लाइफ टाइम अर्निंग्स. सो जैसे जैसे आपके लाइफ टाइम अर्निंग्स जो है वो बढ़ते चले जाएंगे, आपका लेवल ऑफ एजुकेशन साथ में आपको पॉजिटिवली कोरिलेट देखने को मिलता है. दैट व्हेन यू स्टार्ट हायर लाइक बिकमिंग मोर एजुकेटेड, आपका लेवल ऑफ एजुकेशन इंक्रीज कर रहा है तो आपके लाइफ टाइम के अर्निंग्स ऑल्सो आर राइजिंग एंड दैट कंट्रीब्यूट्स सिग्निफिकेंटली इन क्रिएटिंग द डिफरेंस बिटवीन द लो इनकम कैटेगरी ओवरऑल वेज एंड द हाई इनकम कैटेगरी ओवरऑल वेज रेट या उनके सैलरीज को अगर इनके वेजेस के साथ आप कंपेयर करेंगे तो वहाँ आपको डिस्क्रिपेंसी फर्दर या डिस्पैरिटी फर्दर वाइडन अप होती हुई देखने को मिलती है. And according to certain empirical investigations, it is amazing to know that the difference between university and primary qualified workers in a number of developing countries can be as large as 300% to 800%. So आप 300% से लेके 800% तक wages को बढ़ा सकते हैं as compared to the people who are either unskilled or uneducated, या सिर्फ उनके पास अगर प्राइमरी एजुकेशन है तो आप यू कैन डू वंडर्स. आपकी इनकम मैनी टाइम्स इंक्रीज करती है, इवन अप टू द एक्सटेंट ऑफ 800% फ़र्क हो जाता है. और जब आपकी 800% फ़र्क से आपकी इनकम बढ़ जाएगी तो यू विल सी दैट जितने भी इंडिकेटर्स हैं हमें इनकम इनइक्वालिटी को मेजर करने के लिए हम उनको इस्तेमाल करते हैं, उनमें आपको इंक्रीमेंट देखने को मिलता है. सो व्हेन द इनकम इनइक्वालिटी इज एक्सपैंड बिकॉज ऑफ दिस इंक्रीज इन द एजुकेशनल अटेनमेंट, वी सी दैट जो आपका ओवरऑल इनकम पर कैपिटा तो इंक्रीज करेगा लेकिन साथ ही में इनकम इनइक्वालिटी भी वाइडन अप कर जाती है. एंड इफ यू लुक एट द ओवरऑल इम्पैक्ट ऑफ दिस ऑन पॉवर्टी, सो देयर कुड बी multiple effects on poverty. हो सकता है कि there is some sort of trickle down effect on the people who are living in the poor classes or the very low income categories, जिनके ऊपर कुछ फवायद इन लोगों के eventually over a long time period पहुंच जाएं जिनको आपने एजुकेशन दिया है. और in that context the absolute poverty level would be lowered. But if you see that the two classes become distinctly separated and the disparity or the differences between in terms of the income level between the two classes, low income category and high income category में अगर आपको disparities बहुत widening होते हुए देखने को मिल रहे हैं और यहाँ से कोई high income category से कोई भी benefits या advantages या अच्छे वाले policies बन के कुछ facilitation नहीं मिल रहा है low income category को, if that kind of a thing happens, which we see mostly this thing happens, then we observe that absolute poverty level जो है वो आपका decline करने की बजाय constant होने की बजाय it may even get worse. So वो हो सकता है कि वहाँ absolute poverty level in this kind of a setup बढ़ जाए बजाय इसके कि वो decrease हो. So that may also be explained in terms of those resources which have been utilized on the acquisition of this higher educational attainment of the people जो कि अभी highly educated हैं, कि आपने वो resources को अगर आप poor class की welfare के ऊपर spend करते हैं तो probably उसकी वजह से उनकी कोई economic situation better हो सकता था. So there is this trade-off which may happen, and because of that overall you can see that the absolute poverty may go up by spending loads and loads of money from your public exchequer on the higher education of people by subsidizing it or by making it relatively cheap. Another important thing which is linked with educational attainment in developing countries is the concept of internal migration and the concept of brain drain. So we see that in the developing countries, when people acquire education and they acquire skills, so there is this big difference in terms of the wages which the skilled or the educated people are getting, and the unskilled and the uneducated or the uneducated individuals are getting. So we see a big discrepancy in terms of the wage differentials, or the wages, the average wage that is being earned by the people who get educated is relatively higher, and the wage on average which is earned by the people who stay uneducated or they get dropped out or they are still unskilled is relatively low. So because of this major difference in the wages which these two types of people are getting, people decide to go for some changes in the overall improvements in order to improve the standard of life. They decide to migrate from a certain place within a country to another in the pursuit of getting higher levels of income, or they want to improve their standards of life, or they want to improve the standard of education which they can provide to their kids or children. So we see that because of this, the major factor of wage differentials, we see that there is a lot of internal migration. Internal migration is defined as movement of a household from one place to another inside the boundary of a country. So wherever they see that the job prospects are better and the wage or the salaries which they may get when they move to a certain place in the same country will be many times improved or more than what they are getting right now, or the lifestyle or the standards of life or the various amenities or the facilities that they can get in terms of the education and the health facilities will be improved or will be many times better than what they are getting while living in a certain place. They decide to move from one place to another, and although this creates a lot of problems when they settle down in different areas where town planning is not very modern or not of a very enhanced nature. Similarly, we also observe that when the educational attainment increases in a certain developing country, there is a lot of brain drain also, and by brain drain we mean that the immigration of highly educated and skilled professionals and technicians from the developing countries to the developed countries or developed world. We see that again the major idea behind this brain drain is also that the higher wage rate or the higher salary packages and then improved lifestyle helps them in deciding that they should leave this country, the developing country, and they should move on to the developed nation. So another important thing which is interlinked with this one is that when we discuss the cost, the social costs in particular, we saw that in these countries the higher education is highly subsidized. So the major burden is borne or is taken up by the society or by the government. So when it comes to providing the benefit to the society is concerned, then we see that a large number of people, because of not very developed setup or not very developed facilities in the developing country, they decide to move from that particular country to some other country, and overall we see that in the long term the benefit of these highly qualified individuals or technicians is provided to the world which is already developed, and the countries who have paid like their expenses, or who have borne their expenses by reallocating the very scarce resources on educating them or providing them with the required skills. That is something that stays behind, and it becomes very, very difficult for these countries to cope with the developing scenarios and the developing complexities. So we see that over time, these individuals, they either migrate from one place to another within the country, and that also contributes in a lot of problem. Although they provide advanced skilled labor in the industrial sector or the modern sector, but at the same time it creates a number of issues as well, which may retard the process of overall expansion. And at the same time we see that the brain drain is there. So together we have discussed that the political economy of demand and supply of the educational attainment plays a very significant role in deciding how much quantity of education will be provided to the individuals, how the demand is decided, for example, the society decides on the basis of the employment opportunities and the wages which they are expecting in future. That helps them in deciding for whether they should look for some higher education or acquire some sort of education or not. And then we discuss that the private costs and the private returns and the social costs and the social returns are accounted for when we decide for the number of for the educational attainment. Then we see certain disparities in terms of educational distribution, and in the end we discuss what is meant by the internal migration and the brain drain, and what is the major factor that contributes towards this problem. Thank you.